thought no one would ever find out. He thought the badge would protect him. He thought the truth could be buried forever. But what he didn't know was that one small detail would destroy everything. Because what started as a routine encounter would end with 30 years in prison and a lawsuit that cost everything he had. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late to run. This is the story of a cop who crossed the line and paid the price. It began like any other night, a quiet road, a routine patrol. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. At least that's how it was supposed to be. Because in just a few minutes, everything would spiral out of control. And one decision, one moment, would change multiple lives forever. Before we continue with this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What happened next started as a simple traffic stop. What no one expected was how quickly things would escalate. What seemed like a minor situation turned into something far more dangerous. And that's when the officer made his first mistake. But then the tension began to rise. And then the driver started to feel something wasn't right. And that's when the questions began. But instead of answers, there was aggression. And that's when the tone completely shifted. What should have been routine suddenly became hostile. And then the officer's behavior became unpredictable. And that's when fear set in. But instead of de-escalating, things got worse. And that's when the officer crossed the line. What happened next would later shock everyone who saw it. And that's when the situation turned physical. But the force used didn't match the situation. And that's when things spiraled out of control. What should have ended in minutes dragged on. And that's when the victim realized something was very wrong. But there was no way to stop what was happening. And that's when the officer made a decision he couldn't take back. What happened in those next moments would define everything. And that's when the damage was done. But instead of calling for help, something else happened. And that's when the silence began. What followed wasn't protocol. And that's when the cover-up started to take shape. But in that moment, the officer believed he was safe. And that's when he made his biggest mistake. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't alone. And that's when the first piece of evidence was created. But he thought he could control the narrative. And that's when he started rewriting the story. What he reported didn't match reality. And that's when the lies began stacking up. But lies don't stay hidden forever. And that's when small inconsistencies started to appear. What seemed like minor details became major red flags. And that's when people began asking questions. But the officer stayed confident. And that's when he doubled down. What he didn't expect was someone watching closely. And that's when everything started to unravel. What happened next was something he never saw coming. And that's when the investigation quietly began. But at first, it didn't seem serious. And that's when internal review stepped in. What they found didn't sit right. And that's when the footage was requested. But the officer believed it would back him up. And that's when the truth started slipping through. What the video showed told a different story. And that's when everything changed. But it didn't stop there. And that's when witnesses came forward. What they described didn't match his report. And that's when the pressure started building. But the officer kept denying everything. And that's when investigators dug deeper. What they uncovered raised even more questions. And that's when the case gained attention. But now it was bigger than him. And that's when external agencies got involved. What once seemed like a small incident became a major case. And that's when the cracks became impossible to hide. But the truth was already out. And that's when the public started watching. What followed was a complete breakdown of his story. And that's when the evidence piled up. But there was no way to explain it anymore. And that's when charges were filed. What he thought was untouchable disappeared. And that's when he was arrested. But the story didn't end there. And that's when the courtroom battle began. What came out during the trial shocked everyone. And that's when the full truth was revealed. But by then, the damage was undeniable. And that's when the verdict came in. What the jury decided would change everything. And that's when justice finally caught up. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And just like that, the badge meant nothing. What he once used as power became his downfall. And that's when the second consequence hit. The lawsuit. What the victim endured couldn't be undone. And that's when accountability came in another form. But this time it cost him financially. What the court awarded was massive. And that's when everything he had began to disappear. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all gone. He thought he got away with it. He thought no one would question him. He thought the system would protect him. But in the end, the truth was stronger than all of it. Because no matter how deep you bury something, it finds its way back. And no matter how powerful you think you are, accountability always comes. He didn't just lose his job. He didn't just lose his freedom. He lost everything. All because of one moment, one decision, one lie. And in the end, justice didn't just catch up to him, it destroyed him. Because this time, he didn't get away with it.